care when nobody say, but me have to go to party today. I feel wanna split for feel all of vibes. You believe me, I feel drink some NSA. Girl, I call me and say, Papi, where you there? Park anyway, just pull up anywhere. Tell her to out in on the road when summer play. So in other words, you trouble there. Yeah, red light, stop light. Man gone for a champion flight. White from the cheese, I night. Make your wine all night. I'm blessed with life, I'm blessed with life. Lamborghini on the highway, I drive big bikes, and fight. The thing go plug in like come drive. DJ thank God in my life. I'm blessed with life, I'm blessed with life. Yeah, pull up let it topless. With a girl with a place. Light tip girl, say there's something on the blacklist. Hey pretty girl, bring your sister for trusted. Pull up at the party, them say we are the hottest. Yeah, them a wine up. No chase sign on the vodka. Tell some boy don't size up. Them skull like visor. It's like a tambourine. Link up with my family. Tell them a shake. Them like a tambourine. Flying from
Hi everyone. I just have a bit of music in the background before we get started. I'm going to give everyone just another 2 seconds before we get going. Hi Amber, thanks for popping in tonight. I hope y'all can hear the music, but okay, so we are 2 minutes in, so I want to go ahead and get started, just so we can use the most of our time together. Thank you so much, you all, for being here this evening and for checking in on the recording. My name is Cynthia Pearson, and I am one of the Namaste Project's instructors. And this afternoon or this evening, I'm going to be spending some time with you all speaking specifically on informed care and conflict management. Let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay, if I need to speak up a little bit louder, or if you need to ask a question or if you need to raise your hand, please do so virtually. There's a speak button that you can hit, and you can let me know if you would like to share something. A little bit about me. The initials behind my name, I actually have a master's degree in conflict management, and I am a certified clinical trauma specialist and certified crisis intervention specialist. And I spent most of my time actually working in the field of victim advocacy, so working with individuals who spent or who have encountered trauma by way of victimization. And so I left that arena after about 12 years and started working with the Namaste Project, as well as some other agencies, in developing some trauma-informed programs and trainings and education surrounding what does it look like to have informed care, and what does it look like to manage conflict in all of these different spaces that we occupy. So that's why I'm here today, or this evening. So again, if you have any questions along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise your hand to speak, and we can take it from there. So today's learning outcome, what we hope that you will gain from our discussion is how to incorporate mindfulness to improve our interpersonal skills and how to resolve conflict in a more productive manner. So oftentimes we encounter conflict, and it can be very jolting, either in that moment, or sometimes it lingers in our mind and we think about what could we have done differently. And so we're going to go over just a little bit about the background behind what is conflict a bit, how that really interplays with trauma, and how to be trauma informed and trauma aware, and then what we can do. what are some things that we can add to our toolkit moving forward. And I will say that this is the 5th session of the trauma series. So next week, you all will be introduced to empowerment and resilience. And Dr. Arnold will be with you that evening, and she will go into even more in depth of the skill building and some tricks that we can all collectively be reminded of or be introduced to that really help us navigate really the world, right? And our relationships that we're a part of. So as a quick check-in, as we normally do, we like to model the behavior that we speak about, and it is our mood meter. So if you have a moment, check in with yourself, check in with how you're feeling. We look at the mood meter on the x-axis and the y-axis in our areas of energy, high or lower energy, or in the range of pleasantness. And if you don't mind, if you could just pop in the chat, if you don't mind sharing how you're feeling today. Today, I will share that I am feeling focused because I am in the space of this moment with you all. So I'm focused on this content. I'm focused with the information. But I'm also kind of annoyed because my son came back home from daycare with some sort of bug, some sort of sickness. And as if the parents are watching or are there and understand, and any other caregivers, that can just be a real disruption. So I'm trying to focus my energy and being positive with that. But as you all can imagine, that's just what it is. But thank you for sharing, Amber. You're at ease and optimistic. I really appreciate that positive response, because I think as we share more, sometimes that can help alleviate some, anxiety that some of us may have when we're sharing how we're feeling about today. But I'll give it just a moment if anybody else wanted to pop in. Okay, so thank you all. I'm so glad you're here. And just to get some questions rolling or answers rolling in the chat, I have some questions. So if you all could share, when in a conflict, do you typically feel comfortable managing your emotions as the conversation goes? So do you typically feel like I'm in control, or I'm comfortable in just about any conflict? And if you are, if you can just drop a 1 in the chat. And the second question is, have you ever thought or said to yourself, after a conflict, oh, I wish I said that, or I wish I had said this? If that has happened to you, where you've thought about something really good that you could have eased into a conflict to mention, but you forgot about it, prop a number 2 in the chat and let us know if you've had that experience. I will say, yes. I often have that. I always think of some really good, like one-liners sometimes, or, think of, or maybe I even reinterpret what they may have said. And I think of, I could have said this in response to that. And that could be really stressful, because at times I can feel that this is something that I should have said, and could this have changed the outcome? Or you start to think about what ifs, like what if I had said this, what would have happened? It's very common. I think a lot of us experience that, and I also would like to say that at some point we can blame our nervous system for blocking those really good responses, because we're in such a, our body's responding to sometimes what we might perceive as a threat. And that's what's happening. And so we're not getting that full scope of our brain and that work. What kind of responses are going to be helpful. But thanks for sharing that. So as we go through this, I wanted to, again, bridge these concepts of what is trauma-informed care and how that looks or translates into what we're speaking about when it comes to relationships and conflicts. how we interface with students and how we interact with partners and each other as staff, right? So trauma-informed care is a strength-based approach. So what it means is it's emphasizing physical, psychological, and emotional safety, and we're creating opportunities for individuals to rebuild a sense of control and empowerment. So even when we heard from Katie in the last session, when she spoke about communication skills, we realize how quickly communication can really break down with these nonverbal signals alone, right? We often hear that in communication, either courses or communication trainings, even refreshers, is that a lot of our communication is being interpreted by the nonverbals. And so as we look at these concepts from the lens of trauma-informed care, we want to always consider a strengths-based approach. And so what that also translates into is being vigilant. We're anticipating and avoiding processes or practices that can potentially re-traumatize individuals, but it's also more of an awareness and acknowledgement of our lived experiences. I think it's really important to say that trauma informed care isn't necessarily a destination, right? Like we don't get to this point and we're done and it's complete. It's more of a journey, and it is endless, and it's always evolving and continuing and adapting to the individuals that we are around, but also certainly the circumstances that are presented in front of us. And it's really about moving towards compassionate, focused relationships. And we are ultimately choosing, I like to say, choosing connection over division. And sometimes when we talk to parents, we say we're choosing connection over correction. And it's a really unique approach and a positive framework that we are using to apply to situations that could otherwise be divisive, really, or cause even more hardened conflict that may feel unresolved. So I just wanted to pause for that moment and see if anyone had any questions about that or had any thoughts about what that looks like when we're talking about trauma-informed care and this approach to our processes and practices. And if not, I'll move on, but I just wanted to pause there. Okay. So when we're speaking about trauma-informed care and the principles, we're looking at these six core ideas. And these are really, I would like to also say they're pillars for the most part, or things that we look to achieve on a constant basis, or at least try to get to a point where we realize that these are things that we are holding as a value set. And oftentimes we hear about what is trauma aware or trauma sensitive versus trauma responsive and trauma informed. And the ultimate goal is being trauma informed. So as I mentioned earlier, we're speaking about the awareness and acknowledgement of lived experiences. And we've really recapped a lot of these pillars or principles in the previous sessions. When Dr. Arnold was speaking about interoception or neuroception and our awareness of our bodies and that brain gut connection and the axis in which messages are and signals are being delivered from our brain or from our gut to our brain in response to an awareness of a threat or a perceived threat from our nervous system. We also had, heard from Katie in how our communication can sometimes be triggering for individuals in the way that which we communicate and the way that our messages are being received. And so all of the information that you've gathered up until this point speaks about how we can uphold some of these principles in our relationships, in our workplace, with the people that we serve, in our communities. And then we're creating this ripple effect, right, of being aware and conscious and sensitive. And that in turn brings out more awareness, consciousness, and sensitivity for ourselves in our own lives and our own experiences. And so that's why we always speak about how understanding trauma and stress is very important. Not everyone may have an event that equates to trauma for them, but they may have an event that can be overwhelming or that can be extremely stressful. And we also like to see compassion and dependability as a core principle in the way in which we are communicating with individuals and the way in which we operate in our spaces. Cultural humility and responsiveness, being culturally responsive is very important, of course. And again, that also is reflective of the way in which we communicate or the way in which we decide not to communicate. Safety and stability, that's one of those, again, it's not necessarily a destination, but it's a journey, right? We can't always be aware of what someone might perceive as unsafe, but we pretty much have a good foundation and a good idea of what are the things that allow us to show we are promoting safety in the best way by our best practices, by showing that we're trustworthy, that we're collaborative. And that's another way of being reflective of, cultural and historical, racial, and a gender context. The collaboration and empowerment is another one. We're talking about shared decision making here, and how can these principles be incorporated, all six of them really, be incorporated in critical components, right? Like in how we're addressing and how we navigate conflict. And that could look very differently amongst different individuals, if depending on their relationship status, depending on the power dynamic. Particularly, we see that in the workplace. And so we may not always use the same language, but we're always thinking about how we can dissect what's behind someone's response in a way that allows us to give insight into what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak. We often think about, what's behind the scenes, like in the movie, or who's behind the curtain, right? Well, it's not always necessarily who, but it's what, right? So what has happened that's behind the curtain that is showing us what are things that are triggering or creating a response that tells the other receiver, this isn't working, or I need to step back, or maybe this conflict is becoming overwhelming, right? So again, I just wanted to pause there as well, because that is quite a heavy slide in the sense of what we're talking about. And if anyone would like to share how they may use one of these principles, maybe you didn't call it this, maybe that's not the language that you used, but you could see how maybe you are practicing an example of one of these core principles. If anyone would like to share, feel free to raise your hand and speak, or you can pop it in the chat. I'd like to see that. That'd be great. Okay, and one of the things that I want to share with you all as y'all are thinking about that, and maybe even something that you might want to, take some time to journal and think about how these practices are in play in your own spaces, is the idea behind compassion and dependability. We often find that compassion and dependability are things that we don't overtly express as a need or a desire. But the reality is that when we have, Amber, I try to have compassion and be understanding of, yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I was actually thinking, I was getting to that, is it's hard, right? Like it's hard to always practice compassion and understanding, because what we often do, and it's very natural, and it's very common for us to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and think, well, if it was me, I would have done something differently. Or we might say, well, if that was me, I would not have thought it was that. And I use that as a generic way of expressing the degree of severity, but that bad, right? So we usually hear something and we always have we usually have a subconscious response where we're going to put this in a scale, and it's on this continuum of like severity. And we measure that really by what we've experienced ourselves. And we use that framework and apply it to other people. But as I was mentioning, is I often find that we don't always say we need compassion, but generally speaking, when we are expressive with each other, whether in a professional or personal setting, we are usually looking for compassion on the other end. But we don't necessarily say that. Or we're looking for people to be dependable, meaning how often do we find ourselves with even friends or family and they say they're going to be somewhere or they're going to be a part of something and that doesn't happen, and we get that disappointment, or we'll start to maybe even distrust what they're saying. And I think that it really stems back to what we learned earlier in the weeks about how our brain develops. And as we know, the brainstem is that mammalian brain, and that's the first to develop. And it's not until we get into later parts of the evolution do we get into that frontal lobe development and that frontal cortex. And it's really our relationships that start from that development. It's the idea that our species desire the connection, that we desire being in relationship with each other. And that is a part of promoting our safety. So I agree. I think those are, I think those are really important concepts that we don't always speak about because it can be very vulnerable for us. But it is a work in progress for, I think, all of us, for many of us, to try to be more compassionate and understanding. And that is hard, but I think we're all on the right track. And if you're here tonight and you've been at these sessions, I think you're going to start to realize that you're not alone and we're not perfect. And it's about progress and being mindful of it, right? That's really the end goal, is how can we be more mindful about the way in which we show up in different spaces. So thank you for sharing that. And again, as I was speaking, is, we're moving away with the analogy of what's behind the curtain is we're moving away from the question of what is wrong with them? Like, what is wrong with this person? To now being trauma informed, we're asking, what has happened? And the reason why we move away from this response, or we move towards this better framed question, is really, and I ask if there's anyone in the room this evening or later as they're watching the recording, if they're in a clinical space or any of the medical professionals in the district that may be present. But I'm sure they could attest to the idea behind how pathogenic versus salutogenic processes are really in play when we're talking about an approach in the medical field of how we address the question of what has happened to somebody. And the idea behind that is, we're very much primed and groomed in our learning to have a more of a pathogenic approach, which is the question of what is wrong with them, right? So if you speak to a medical professional or someone in a clinical setting, they're with a pathogenic approach, we're separating the body from emotions, thinking, and behavior. And pathogenic focuses are important when you're talking about acute symptoms, or in medical terms, it's great because if you're thinking about the problem in a localized area or in one organ of the body, that's one system. We can now address it with a specialist to deal with that acute disease, right? And so the idea is that pathogenic approaches do not address environmental, whole personhood, lifestyle, or even like prevention. So pathogenic is another way of saying we're laser focused on problems and deficits, right? And like, what is the prescription for this, right? What is the diagnosis, and what is the solution? So what has emerged in the culture of mental health and over many years of reevaluating these approaches, and this is true to social work fields even, but one of the things that's emerged from this is how can we be how could we be less pathogenic and view our emotions and thinking and behavior as a comprehensive approach to addressing the question of what has happened to someone. And so truly trauma informed approaches are more salutogenic. So it's on the whole well-being and not pathogenic in nature. So I hope that offers some sciencey insight, some medical insight into why these approaches of trauma-informed care, and how we're speaking about these core principles, like I mentioned in the earlier slide, really are about the whole picture, right? I used to work in juvenile court for many years, and oftentimes when we were working with court-involved youth, in different reports, and it was either pre-sentencing reports or reports given to like an attorney general that was representing the Department of Family and Children's Services, or anyone who wanted to get an idea or a scope of what this juvenile's life was like. We often looked at what was the totality of the circumstances. What are the other issues involved in this environment? What is the child's home life like? And, many times I will speak to this, to this court that I was working with. They often found ways in which to divert cases. So although this person may be now a court involved youth, however, the idea behind restorative justice and rehabilitation is that we're not going to go through a process that just furthers the harm that's being committed. We're wanting to look at the whole person. We're wanting to look at the environment and not think of it as I mentioned earlier, like this pathogenic focus where it's the acute symptom, we're localized, and we're just going to offer a sentence recommendation and not consider all these other elements, right? So that's an example that I wanted to share. And in addition to that, in working with victims of crime, where we work with individuals who've had more complex trauma, it's more about what is the history of events that have happened in your life that have led to this point of how your body is responding to certain stressors, right? So when that I'm working with a client, I'm not looking at necessarily or exclusively the crime that was committed against them, if it was robbery or something. I'm looking at what has happened in their whole life that we can also incorporate in that healing process and in that journey of awareness that has happened as a result of this victimization, right? And so looking at all of those pieces and not just the one reason that they're in front of you, right? Especially in the clinical space, you're looking at something that is the whole person, their whole being, right? It's not a person that's just this, it is their whole selves, right? And that's the idea behind having a truly trauma-informed approach that is salutogenic. And I wanted to pause there as well, if anyone had any takeaways from that. So as we are moving through trauma-informed care and why all of that is relevant, let's look into how this applies to conflict even more deeply. And as I was mentioning, we see conflict, and oftentimes it can elicit our natural fight or flight response, or fawn, right? We have also fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses that can happen. And so, what we're looking at is how we can be intentional about being mindful or having mindfulness activities to encourage active, open, and curious listeners. Conflict is a struggle, right? It's a struggle that occurs when our needs and goals are incompatible with someone else. And, I was mentioning earlier about compassion and dependability. Oftentimes we see that as a need that's not expressed. But when conflict arises, it means that there's an unmet need, that there was something that has happened that hasn't been met. And we sometimes conflate our needs and feelings differently. And there's a list, and I'll have to share it with you all in the participant guide later. But there's a long list of feelings. And it's funny because we think about feelings, and sometimes we always think of maybe like a handful, right? Like we're quick to think of like a really good handful of feelings, but there's hundreds of feeling words. And oftentimes we're using feelings and instead of indicating our needs. And what is our need that's not being met in a conflict? Or what is a goal that's incompatible with the other person that we're in that conflict with? And the idea behind our fight and flight response as it relates to conflict, is that our nervous system is really, and what you've heard so oftentimes in these trauma sessions, and we keep reiterating, is that our nervous system is the foundation of our lived experience and the meaning that we give those experiences. Okay. So again, I'll repeat that. Our nervous system is the foundation of our lived experiences and the meaning by which we give those experiences. So if we haven't attached a meaning to that experience, then we have not given our nervous system an idea of how to respond to that or mimic that response to something that looks familiar in the future. And so when that happens, our body is keenly aware of what to do next. But so that also means that we have the power to start to retrain or use mindfulness activities to encourage the way in which we listen to ourselves and are obviously listening to other people in a conflict as well. And the dual concern model for conflict is based on two underlying dimensions. So concern for self, so assertiveness, and concern for others, empathy, which is a big one. And you heard that last week, actually, with Katie as well, from empathetic listening. And the second dimension is group members balance their concern for satisfying personal needs, pro-self, and the needs and interests of others, pro-social. So we think about the dual concern model often in how we can approach conflict. So when you dissect a conflict, are we looking at where is my concern for self in this equation? Where is my concern for others in this equation? Or if we're part of a larger group, what does pro-self look like and what does pro-social look like? And this allows us to really begin to frame how we're going to approach conflict, but also how we're going to value the outcome of that conflict and where do we want to see that outcome lie. Is it going to be heavy on the assertiveness side, so more pro-self, more concern for self? Or is it going to be on the others, more concern for them, or pro-social, the interest of others? Okay, so I will ask in the chat if anyone is familiar with the Thomas and Kilmann styles of animal characters. Has anyone seen this before or has identify these animals as symbols for what's familiar to you. I will say that I am, oftentimes a fox. So that's me. But if anyone would like to share, please go ahead and pop in the chat or raise your hand to speak if any of these animal characters are familiar to you when you've heard of conflict styles. And as we're thinking about that, I'll explain that the y-axis concerned for goals and the x-axis is concerned for relationships. And as you can imagine, the animals where they're placed is the difference between where their concern level or the degree of their concern level is against the relationship in that conflict or in the other person, and the degree in which they're concerned for the goals is on the y-axis. So Thomas and Kilman created these style. You have to think about that one. Thank you. Yeah, it's hard, and I will say that as you hear more about this, you'll start to see that you can be really almost any of these styles depending on the scenario, right? I just know for myself, I'm often the fox, but maybe that's just because of my training and things. Like I often think about a lot of things, so I'm always like, thinking of all the possible scenarios. But that can be problematic too when we're talking about concern for self. So anyway, so when we're talking about these animal characters, I'll start with the fox. So we're looking at low impact compromises. So it's really more of, I'll give you this if you give me that, right? So the compromising fox is a really interesting conflict management style, because the individuals have more of a strategy of a little something for everyone, right? Like, so how can we find mutually acceptable solutions that can satisfy both parties? And I think that the caveat with the compromising fox is that it feels that something is being taken away in some degree, or that we're not really getting, technically, if you look at a scale, right, of a pie, we're not really getting each the real size of the pie we want, right? It may sound like it's compromising, or it may feel like we're sharing part of the bigger pie, but the reality is that the sections are not as big as we thought. And so that may not always work for certain conflicts, because we're not looking at the real need or the unmet need that is not being said, or the unmet goal that's not being clearly addressed. So the compromising fox can sometimes feel a little empty-handed, right, at the end of this conflict. And the teddy bear. So can anyone want to share what they think about when they hear a teddy bear as an animal character in describing conflict? Okay, so with the teddy bear, we're looking at a quote here is, lose the battle, win the war. Okay. It is really like a whatever you say kind of response. So teddy bears are also, soothing and accommodating, as you can imagine, in the characterization of a teddy bear. But oftentimes they're neglecting their own desired outcomes. And so there is an element of self-sacrifice here. But the idea behind it is that they're so focused on accommodating and soothing the other parties, that they often don't get anything, if at all, what they intended to gain or resolve at the end of the outcome. It's just because their concern for relationship is really high, as you can see on the scale. It's a high concern for the human relationship. And if we can look at the turtle, as you can see, is really close to the X and Y axis joining part. So you can imagine that there's little concern for relationship and a little concern for goals. So what do you think that could look like in a conflict? How are they going to be perceived? And it says here, rarely, if ever. So rarely, if ever, is a key of an avoidant style. So the avoidant turtle is what we would call it. It's conflict. It's like, what conflict? There's nothing going on. Turtles, as you can think about in real life, they pull their head back into their shell. They're avoidant. They withdraw, deny oftentimes, or just delay the conflict, right? So this is, I'd rather hide and ignore the conflict than resolve it. So we see that, and we recognize that these outcomes is that they can lead to be uncooperative, unassertive, and they're giving up personal goals. So they may try to maintain relationships, but oftentimes these negative feelings may linger. And I will say that the avoidant turtle can be me at some time in some instances, especially in personal relationships. You know, you kind of want to avoid it, but we often sort of, you know, beat ourselves up in a way when we think about that particular conflict that we're avoiding, and all these feelings that are stirring inside, are ruminating inside, and we haven't been able to let those go or let those out and express themselves and live, like sit in that feeling. And so the avoidant turtle we see often with relationships, personal relationships. But we, again, equally can see that in a professional setting as well, in business, because there could be some consequences that individuals may not want to face or have to deal with that conflict that arises out of those consequences. So that could be almost like a never ending cycle. And we have up top the owl, which does have a higher concern for goals. Does anyone want to share their idea behind the animal character of the owl for conflict? So the owl has long-term planning. So it's about team efforts. It's, my preference is, well, what's your choice? That's usually the response. Well, what would you like to see happen? So owls, are collaborative. They're problem confronting, and so they value goals and relationships. And what they like to do is gather information, look for alternatives, and dialogue more openly than we typically see in, for instance, the teddy bear, or obviously in the turtle. And they welcome disagreement. So they want to hear any kind of feedback that you have. And owls view conflicts as problems to be solved and work to find solutions that are agreeable to all sides. So the reality is that the owl is a really well-rounded, if you will, characteristic of a conflict management style, because the owl is not necessarily avoidant of conflict, welcomes to hear any conflict or opposing positions, and is really seeing conflict as an opportunity to create communication, right? So what we see and what we train it often on is conflict is an opportunity to have a discussion. And it really means something needs to be said or something needs to be hashed out, and let's look together to find alternatives or solutions that work best for all of us. It is like the end, it is a good end goal to have, or at least try to work towards. And I usually say that the owl is hard to do because there's so many components of conflicts that really impact ourselves personally. And, you know, there's some things that can be really triggering, but if we can practice more on how to be an owl and how to value each other's goals and relationships, then we can really walk into just about any conflict and feel good about ourselves and the outcome, because we have high concern for ourselves, the goals, the relationships, and it is more of a collaborative approach without feeling like someone's leaving something on the table. And so, last but certainly not least, and one that I feel like we've all been at some point in our lives, or at least maybe like, you know, 40, 30 years ago when we may have been young toddlers or babies, is the shark animal character. So, as you can imagine, what if anyone likes to share what is a shark animal character in conflict? So, the shark is unpopular but necessary decision. So, as an unpopular meaning, it's do it my way or not at all. Okay, the typical attitude of a shark is either using force or competing style to achieve goals. And so they need to win. The shark is above all about self and concern for their goals. And when competing, this person usually uses his or her concerns at the other's expense. And so there's very little collaboration, very little, again, concern for others or having like open dialogue. And they strongly, strongly defend a position they believe is correct or simply try to win. And I will say that I had a competitive shark the other day with my toddler, and it is very much do it his way or not at all. So I had to be very compromising, but it is a quality that I think can be helpful if in certain ways, right? But it's also really good to be aware of this competitive shark because there's always a competitive shark somewhere. Just like in in nature, there is a shark that we may not see, but will come out when needed. And I think that it's a really good way to the animal characters are a good way to identify conflict management skills because we can kind of think of the animals in the real world, right? In nature as they are, and as we learn about animal characteristics, can be very similar to what we see in the human species. So these are really fun, but also easy ways to identify conflict and to, and sometimes in some moments, be able to call somebody out if they're in a conflict with you and they're acting a certain way that could be problematic or that isn't helpful to the discussion or to the conflict. So now that we've gone over these conflict management styles by way of animal characters, I'll ask you, Amber, since I know you said you had to think about this, but now that we've had a little more in depth about these qualities, which one do you think you're leaning more towards? Or if anyone would like to share, which animal most represents you? Okay, I will keep moving on. And I had a video to share, but honestly, we're running out of a little bit of time. So we're going to skip that. Oh, leaning towards a fox, but maybe a bear. Nice. And have you, and I'll go back to the slide if anyone else wants to share. Have you found that it depends on the type of relationship, Amber, between the fox and the bear? Or are you usually like the fox at work, the bear at home, or vice versa? I feel like I might be the fox at work and the bear at home, but if you wanted to share that. Okay, so we are going to move on. So I wanted to share this quote from Resma Manikim, and somebody that y'all can find online, and he's on social media. Great teacher, and yeah, it depends on where I am. Absolutely. I think contextually, it really depends a lot for many of us too. But I wanted to share this quote because I really think it sort of helps us look at trauma and conflict in a very comprehensive way. So it says here, trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like culture. And I wanted to sit with this for a minute. And if anyone wanted to give feedback on this statement, or if something that came up when you read this, if you wanted to, I wanted to give space for that, because I think the first time I heard this and read it, it really sat with me and made me think and gave me this big aha moment and really opened up my eyes to a lot of work that we do, but a lot of the work that still needs to get done, right? Especially within ourselves and in our communities. So I'll stop speaking and allow for anyone who would like to speak to raise their hand, or if you wanted to drop in the chat what came up for you when you read this. So I'm going to give a little bit of some context too, for anyone who might need sort of like a prompt or a leadway into a response for this. But when I saw that trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality, I thought about what traits we exhibit even with each other, whether it's like not trusting or shyness, or even while in a conflict. Are these traits, or are these personality characteristics reflective of trauma experiences, or what we may be concerned about in being aware of potential trauma, or our body is showing awareness of an event that looks similar, or is perceived to be threatening, right? That what came up for me. For family traits, trauma in a family decontextualized, what do we see modeled? What have we seen modeled by our parents or caregivers, by elders in our family or in our communities? Those are those family traits that we are exhibiting or seeing, and then starting to now unlearn. Is that as a result of trauma? And then culture. Trauma in people decontextualize over time looks like culture. And this idea is that, what is unique, or the question that comes up is, what is unique about our culture that can be attributed to behaviors marked by a historical significance, or marked by historical events? Generational trauma comes up for me when I think about that. Racial trauma comes up when you think about different events that have like moments in time that capture events that are traumatic. And what is that? How is that reflective of the way in which our relationships develop, our family traditions or dynamics in the family, and certainly in how our communities have evolved, and what that looks like for a community that is reflective of some of these events. And I say all of that to circle back to, what does it also look like when we're in conflict, right? So what comes up when we're in conflict are some of these characteristics, or some of these traits coming in to our our systems at play. Are these traits that are being exhibited are as a result of events that we've experienced or that have been passed down? So it's a heavy quote, and I think it's something that we can think about and really, again, build on that idea behind compassion and for ourselves and for each other. But I also say that, like trauma, the idea behind resilience can also be passed down to generations, right? So, and I don't want to touch too much on that, but next week with Dr. Arnold's, it will be covered empowerment and resilience, and so you're really going to get to dive into that concept of empowerment and what does resilience look like and how can we build resiliency. And we'll see how our brain works well when we've experienced something that is adversity or high stress, but then we've come out of it and we build coping skills. So then our brain really is kind of doing like this dive of, you know, we're up and we come down, but we're building these coping skills to continue to come up. And so just like the waves that we see in a brain scan, right? Like these are the things that we need to build, right? These are the resilience that we build. And so I think that can also be passed down from generations. And we do see that. And we have many examples of how resilient people can be and generations can be. And here are some reflective questions that I wanted to leave you all with that also stemmed from this quote, but I think it's really a good way to incorporate some of these questions in journaling or as a group. You can take this like with a small group or a larger group, but these questions are really meant to be reflective of how we show up in spaces, especially when we're trying to promote trauma-informed principles and values in our workspace, but also within our relationships. Is what responsibility do we have to understand the effects of trauma in our work? How do we guide our work in light of knowing about being or having pervasive trauma in our world? And how does our own trauma affect our ways of engaging in work or in relationship? And have you noticed the effects of traumatic experiences in yourself during conflict? Or have you noticed the effect of traumatic experience among others during conflict? So are you witnessing that for other individuals too? That you're seeing those autonomic nervous system responses, that you're seeing the sweatiness, that maybe the palms are looking clammy, or redness in faces. Sometimes it's someone looking pale, or someone having their eyes really wide open, or someone not being able to really utter any more words. So many different characteristics that we heard from earlier in the weeks about how our nervous system responds to the potential of threat, or maybe the perception of threat, and what that looks like in conflict. So I wanted to leave you all with the final two questions. If anyone would like to share, again, you can raise your hand to speak, or you can pop it in the chat. Is now that we've sort of covered all of these components of trauma-informed principles, trauma-informed values, and the way in which they are a part of conflict management and recognizing conflict management styles and key components to think about when we're in conflict, what's circling in your mind right now? What are some questions lingering that you may have? Or triangle is, what's an aha moment so far? What has been a lasting takeaway from what you've heard today? Anyone can pick a circle or a triangle. You can write or type in the chat circle and then put a dash and then your response, or you can type in triangle and then a dash and then put in a response. Or again, you're welcome to share and raise your hand. We have a few seconds left on the clock, but I would welcome anyone that would like to share. And if we don't have anyone that is able to share now, I will say that my takeaway so far has been about having more conversations. That's really what this is about, is speaking out more and really acknowledging individuals. And I think we hear often that, we all want to be seen and heard. And fundamentally, we have to do better at speaking out, and certainly better at acknowledging individuals and the spaces and how they show up in spaces, and seeing that things, someone might need support, right? And those are things that we can actually do. Those are tangible things that we can really take away, to be more collaborative, to be more responsive, and to be more informed in how we show up in the different spaces that we occupy. And thank you, Amber. So I really like the animal chart as a way to reflect on how I handle conflict. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really digestible. Like if you think about animals, these are characters that we're all at some point familiar with. I think that they're easy to think about when we describe how they are in the animal kingdom, and how maybe we might be reflective of some of those characteristics. Although it's a bit animated, but still. Yeah, I agree. I think it's a great way to offer reflection in that space. Okay. Well, if that is all for the now, if anyone else wants to share, feel free to email us as well. And I will, again, drop in the participant guide the list of feelings versus needs. So you all can take a look at that and use that as part of your toolbox as well in identifying words or needs and things, how sometimes we conflate the opposing need with the feeling. And it's a really great exercise to look at. But I can be reached at Trauma Conflict Consulting on Instagram, or email Cynthia at thenamasteproject.net. And thank you all so much for being here and sharing your space with me. I am so grateful to be here and with you all and to hear your experiences and your feedback. So again, next week is the last session. So congratulations for getting this far and absorbing all of this information. But Dr. Arnold is going to speak about empowerment and resiliency and how we can just build those muscles. So thank you all again so much. I hope you have a wonderful evening or wonderful afternoon if you're watching the playback or the recording. And we will see you again soon on the other side of the screen. So take care, everyone. Bye-bye.